Seizure warning. Please don't have a seizure. Okay, let me outline 5 basic principles in order to get this sort of glitchy Rezz sound. The first one is bit rate and downsampling. Next is not being afraid to break your key signature. Next, we have dynamic filtering and LFOs, a lot of LFOs. And the last one is called a buffer shuffler. We're going to use the buffer shuffler. So there are 2 different parts of this track that I want to break down. The first is a lead part, and the second is the drop, which is what you heard at the beginning of this video. Here is the lead part. Okay, and then we're going to get to the drop in just a little bit, but we're going to do the melody part first, and I know you probably came for the drop, but we're going to do that second. Before we get into the actual sound design of this lead, I want to get into a little bit of theory, just a little. I mentioned it at the beginning of the video. We're going to get into breaking key signatures. So if we check this out here, we can see that the first note is a D sharp or an E flat. That is the tonic. That is the key that we're working within in this song, E flat minor. We can see though, we super quick flatten it to a D, which essentially implies a E flat harmonic minor. So with breaking keys, I don't want to get too far into it. I am not a theory guy. I am a more tech focused guy. But essentially, whenever I think the cadence calls for it, we add a note that is just outside the key. We don't want to go too crazy. We don't want to make this so dissonant that it almost sounds atonal. We are not going for atonal. We want to pick something that is right next to something that's within the key. So let's say we are working within a minor key. Well, we're essentially going to take something that might be the 5 or the 3 of the key signature, and we're going to put a note 1/2 step up or 1/2 step down. And by doing this sparsely, it adds a little bit of spice, a little bit of like a haunting side to the actual melody itself. Right, I said I wouldn't get too much into theory. I'm going to leave it there. Let's go into the sound design of this. We have a bunch of Ableton plugins, which I'm going to go to in just a second. We will start in Serum. Now, this is all great. We can go through this. But first, I really want to highlight that, like I said in the beginning of the video, the important thing about this tone is the LFO. The LFO and dynamic filtering, which is essentially just an LFO on a filter. So if we look at the matrix, these 3 things, LFO 1, 2, and 3, modulating a wavetable position, modulating the EQ frequency in the effects rack, and the filter cutoff, that's what's making this tone, along with an envelope that has basically just no sustain, so it's kind of plucky. Those 3 things together are making the tone sound like what it is. With that in mind, let's solo it and see what's going on here in Serum. Okay, so LFO 1, modulating wavetable. So if we hear that sound just by itself, this is what it's doing. Oscillator B. And then both of them together. The sub being a square wave adds a little bit of grit to the bottom end. A lot of these effects aren't really doing much. They are mostly there to add a little bit of taste, but if you want to have a quick run through of all of them, I don't want this to be like an hour-long video though. So take a picture if you want, or we can just keep going. Again, biggest thing I'm going to come back to again in just a little bit. The LFOs are modulating specific points. The LFO 3 is probably the most important. It's the one moving the filter, which is giving it that sort of vocal effect. You can hear it on specific notes. So it's what's giving it that like meow effect. You can hear it mostly on the downbeats. So if I bring this up here, it's going to show up primarily on those two notes because they're on the downbeat of the measure, and that's where the LFOs are hitting the hardest. Hear that bow happening in time because the LFOs are synced. If you're curious how to do that, if we go into Serum, I have them set at a rate that is BPM specific, and it's every half note. Ableton plugins, an OTT doing an OTT thing, EQ8 just adding a little bit of high end, cutting the low end, and then these two things are the interesting things. This is an LFO. It's a Max for Live device. We go to Max for Live and go to Audio Effect, type in LFO. This is what I'm using. It is mapped to an LFO. So I have an LFO modulating an LFO, which is modulating a tremolo. And essentially, if I put it on a square wave, it works as a kind of self-oscillating distortion. So if we listen to it now, so I want you to watch the screen and watch whenever the LFO gets way up high there with the dial. That's where it's beginning to self-oscillate. It makes this really cool effect. Sounds unstable. It sounds evil to me, which is kind of what I was going for with this. So really cool trick. Modulate the LFO of the tremolo with another LFO. Right, so like I said, LFOs, huge part, automate things with LFOs. You can also use them to make dynamic filters. And the other thing I wanted to bring up that I mentioned at the beginning of the video, breaking the key signature, just like we did here. Right, okay, so let's hear the drop now. So this drop is much more simple than the lead I showed earlier. There's really not a lot to it. First off, if we look at the MIDI notes, they are just eighth notes and they are just E flat, which we said earlier is the tonic or the root of this entire song. Now, if we look at the sound design that went into this, we have OTT and Digital Clip Center, which I put on anything that I want to sound a little bit more gritty. We have an EQ rolling off the low end. In Serum, truly what matters in this are the LFOs modulating the filter cutoff, which is giving us that vowel noise, just like in the lead, and this distortion called downsample. Now, in order to understand what downsample means, we're going to need to understand bitrate. Now, this downsample is essentially just lowering the bitrate so our dynamic range makes more clipping. It is a clipping that's happening on purpose, and it's a clipping that is desirable. Let's solo just the bass. Watch what happens if I take this off. It's so important to have that downsample on in order to get the high end, which is that edge sound from Rezz's track, Edge. Yeah, there's really not a lot to that tone. That tone is awesome and it's genius and it's dead simple as well. The only other thing I could say is you're going to want to find a good kick that punches through the mix. If you wanted to, you could use side chain compression, put it on the bass so it gets a little bit out of the way of the kick whenever it comes through. And the very last thing I want to talk about is the buffer shuffler. The last thing I want to share today is not really a Rezz technique, but it is really cool for adding a lot of glitchy elements to your mix. This is the final thing, a buffer shuffler. Now, the buffer shuffler is available in Max for Live Essentials. I'm pretty sure it's free, comes standard. As long as you have Live 9 and up, you should be all set. If you look inside of Max for Live audio effects, it is the second thing down, the buffer shuffler. So here is my process for this. We have our drop tone. What we're gonna do is we're gonna make another audio track and we're gonna label it glitch print. We're gonna set the input of that to our drop sound, or downsample in this case, that's what it's called. Forget all these plugins for now. We're gonna go over them in a second. So I'm just gonna turn all of them off, enable record, and we are going to basically print our drop into an audio track. Okay, so now if we listen back to our audio track, this is what we have. Sounds exactly like our drop. So I'm gonna turn on all of these. These are just my choices for adding a little bit of flavor. I have a reverb and I have a couple of other things like an auto pan and an overdrive, and I don't actually think this Redux is doing anything. The important thing that I have on here is a gate. I've set the threshold so it selects certain parts of the signals to essentially not let in. If it doesn't pass a certain threshold, we are not going to get that sound. So if I turn the gate on, here's what we have. So we are going to get a little bit of some omissions, and it's going to give it a little bit of a glitchier quality, but that's not really the important thing. The important thing is the buffer shuffler. So what this is a whole measure divided into eighth notes, step 8. And what we've done is on certain beats, it's going to add more or less of a stutter and then more or less of a pan. We have a bunch of other things too. I just don't have them engaged. I only have stutter or pan set to random variables. The higher up it goes, the more likely it's going to have a more drastic effect. So let's hear it now. Right, so this is about halfway through the process. If you notice, we don't see any of that showing up on the waveform. That's because the waveform is pre-fader. This is still the exact same signal that we printed from the downsample. So everything that we're hearing is post-fader. We're hearing everything after it goes through all these effects, but this audio file itself has no effects on it besides what it got from the downsample track. So what we need to do is make another audio effect called glitch, and this is where we're going to print all those effects. So we're going to set the input to glitch print, delete what we had here before. We are going to enable recording, and then we are going to record. Okay, so let's check out what we have now. If we see the difference in these waveforms, this one, pre-fader again, came from downsample. This one is all the effects from this channel moved to a new channel. So without any of the plugins on in the glitch channel, here's what it sounds like. Now, to add just a little bit more glitchiness to it, I'm going to turn on another buffer shuffler. I'm going to select auto. Now what this does is every time a new measure rolls around, it's going to load in a new set of random variables. So if you listen to it now, you can hear how it's randomly, whenever it wants, pans to different sides of the stereo image, and it's also adding a new level of stutter. I have another OTT on here just to give it a little bit more flavor. Now check out how this sounds if I then add in the original downsample. We're going to turn off glitch print. We don't use it. We only use it as a means to get this final audio track. Pretty cool. We get a lot more texture. We get these interesting things moving in and out of the track, moving from ear to ear, that make the otherwise repetitive bass line have a little bit more vibrance to it. Cool. Let's hear this in the entire track. Take a listen carefully because it's kind of embedded in there. It's something that you hear more subconsciously than you do consciously. That that was the final thing, the buffer shuffler. Wasn't really a Rezz thing, it was more a me thing. I just think it adds a lot of really cool texture to a mix. To recap, we have downsampling and bitrate, crucial if you want to get that Rezz sound. We also have breaking the key. Make sure that we break the key signature in key in important places. Third, we have LFOs. So many LFOs, all of which are modulating different parameters. The most important parameter to modulate is number 4, the filter cutoff. Remember, that's how we get that vowel sound. And the final thing, not really a Rezz thing, but a cool glitchy thing, is the buffer shuffler. Okay, thank you so much for watching. I am glad you stuck around, and please subscribe if you would like to.